Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. Can you guys hear me all right? Welcome, welcome, welcome. So, big topic today. If you are interested in how they're going to be brainwashing our children, how they are brainwashing our children, this is the show you want to watch. Please go ahead and smash that like button, share this out with other people who might be interested in this so they can get in on this conversation. I'm going to be jumping around quite a bit today because it's a big topic, and I want to make sure that I show you things that are going to help make it clear. In a nutshell, Transformative Social Emotional Learning, or TSEL, or SEL, because sometimes I just leave the T off, the current iteration of social emotional learning, is designed to transform our culture. So it's not designed to transform your individual child, though it is. I mean, that's not where it stops. It is designed to transform the culture completely, from what you think it is to what people want it to be. Hello, Ego Brain. Hello, Mantis. Hello, Nil. Hello, everybody. So if you don't want to transform the culture that dramatically, you're probably not going to like what I'm going to tell you. Now, the first question you might have is, from what to what, Deb? So what do you transform from? What do they want to change? Well, when you think of America or being American, you might think of things like individual liberty, individualism, reason, Western Enlightenment values, skepticism, personal responsibility, work ethic, things like that, right? Um, Equality under the law. You shouldn't discriminate based on things like race and sex and sexual orientation, that we shouldn't discriminate. We're all equal under the law, that kind of stuff. You might think of those things. And that our culture essentially supports entrepreneurship and individuality and all that good stuff, right? Freedom of speech, regardless of whether it's popular speech or not, right? Well, that is not what today's progressive educators want our culture to be. What, as we've talked about before on this channel, they would like to see is critical theory fully realized. And a critical theory is that we'd all be freer, we'd all be happier, we would all be liberated if only we could tear down everything we've got, and then utopia will just happen. If we weren't so doggone individualistic, if we just understood how to be part of the collective more, if we would set aside our selfish little individual needs and be group oriented and align ourselves with groups, then some magical utopia would happen. We would all be equal. We'd all have equity. We'd have equal amount of stuff. Nobody would be poor. Nobody would be sad. Everything would be wonderful. Yeah, it is that crazy, but they really do believe it. Okay. So SEL, social emotional learning, used to be what originally was conceived of as a curriculum area or something to think about at school, was the precondition for learning in a school environment. School environment is inherently social, isn't it? Right? You're in a group, you're in a classroom, there are other people there. They're not related to you, you don't know them, right? And in a public setting, of course, it's people coming in from all over. I mean, there's not really a lot of, um, you know, homogeneity in terms of who's coming into the classroom in a public school setting, increasingly, especially in urban settings, but even around the rest of the country. And so the idea was, in order to make it possible for all the students to learn, to function in the classroom, we needed to, pay attention to whether they were socially and emotionally ready for that experience. So it kind of makes sense that you would want to pay a little bit of attention to the preconditions for that. Well, it used to be back in the way back when we were kids that all that meant was setting some classroom rules and standards and holding the kids to them. In other words, being modeling what was appropriate and then addressing issues as they come up with individuals. So if an individual student was having some difficulties because they were not socially or emotionally prepared to function in class, you might deal with that individual student and do some kind of coaching or remediation and, hold them to the classroom standards and rules of decorum or rules of behavior, or getting along well with others or managing emotions. But you would address it on a case by case basis to help the individual access the learning more effectively. And then it was decided, couldn't tell you by whom, but at some point in time, that we just should do all the students. We should just focus on the social emotional learning skills of all the students. We're not going to wait for, individuals to show us they need this. We've got kids coming in from all different backgrounds, and it sounded right. Right. It sounded right. Like, oh, they're not getting it at home. And there's so many broken homes and kids, divorced parents, and there's problems and there's trauma. And again, it sounded true. Right? It's like, oh, yeah, statistically, I guess, yeah, there's some kids. But the assumption was, oh, with so many kids coming from broken homes, that means they're not learning how to behave. And that means they're not ready for school. And that means the parents aren't doing their job. So there was sort of a leap made from some statistical realities to some assumptions about behavior, predictions about behavior, predictions about readiness for school. Some of which might have, like I said, might have been grounded in reality even within that community, and some of which were just gross generalizations applied to millions and millions of children. And there was also a profit motive because a lot of the companies making this curriculum were profit based. So, hey, look, we can mass market SEL curriculum. Well, once you start talking about things like social and emotional learning, you're getting into the psychology of students. You're starting to get into areas that they don't cover for us in, teacher education. I was only in a teacher education graduate program, not an undergraduate program, but even so, we took child development and that's it. We didn't take child psychology. We're not clinicians. We're not licensed. We don't know how to mess around in the mind of a child, nor do we really even know how to properly assess the psychological makeup of a child. And when I was learning, I was told to not even go there because that could get you into trouble. You really don't want to be messing with a kid's head because you don't know the whole story. You don't know what's going on at home. You don't know. You've got to deal with what you see right in front of you. And so it used to be the teachers were told, don't color outside the lines. Refer the child to the counselor, refer the child out. If you think that there's something beyond what you can do with classroom management, you are not a psychologist. Do not try to be the child's therapist. Okay. So SEL, like I said, was more about, okay, I think this child is having a lot of difficulty dealing with our classroom rules. Maybe we need the help of the counselor, and we'll go outside there. Once they decided, all the students need this. All the students need to have this, mood regulation and anger management and relationship skill building and how to make friends, all this stuff. The kind of things when you look at what they're talking about, you think, isn't that for parents to do? Like, isn't that the kind of thing the kids either just learn on their own, trial and error, just figure it out, right? Or for mom and dad and culture outside the classroom. And then the only purpose for the teacher is to like hold the classroom culture together. Like when you look at some of these things, you think, well, yeah, I mean, those are all things a child needs to learn. I don't dispute that, but maybe not from you, right? But it was just decided schools should do this too. Except, like I said, they just decided it and put it on classroom teachers. Classroom teachers were not trained to do any of this. And then said, here's your curriculum package, and here are the lessons, and here are the things you can do and the activities you can do. And when you start looking what those activities are, like, this is meditation. This is like new agey, almost prayer-like stuff. And then they'll point to some research and say, well, research indicates that when children who have behavior problems meditate, they're able to better regulate their moods. I don't doubt it. But that's the kind of thing, again, you would take the individual child having difficulty managing their emotions, you would refer them out. Then when conference with the parents, maybe they would talk about different solutions, one of which might be learning to meditate or do yoga or get exercise or whatever, change their diet, go see a therapist. But it's not even, okay? It's not that now we're going to sit and do yoga in the class, or we're going to meditate together in the class, and we're going to have a little Buddhist, singing bowl in the class. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that's happening. And then, of course, you have the efforts to, if we're going to be super proactive about making sure that these kids are emotionally, ready to learn, well, we got to get inside their heads and find out, don't we? We're not going to wait. We're going to get right on in there and we're going to start asking, how do you feel? How do you feel today? How do you feel tomorrow? How do you feel the next day? How do you feel about mom? How do you feel about dad? How do you feel about your siblings? How do you feel about school? What do you like best about school? What do you hate about school? Like prying into the child's mind. Boundaries be damned. And that was just regular SEL. That was just regular. It's like was started as kind of like a good thing to know about so you can respond effectively and deal with some of the problems that are coming up and kids having problems learning in school. Became let's do it for everybody. Then it became let's proactively figure out who we need to do, who we need to, do it for like intensively and how we can do it. And so we're just all ready and we know everything about them. And of course, now we've arrived at the point where I don't know if this was by design from the beginning or not, but maybe the temptation was just too great that as long as they're in there, as long as they're in their little minds, as long as we're getting to know them so well, let's rewire them the way we want them to be. And that's transformative SEL, thus the word transformative. So we want to transform the culture, but what is the best way to transform the culture? All the dictators have told us. Literally, they've all told us this. Stalin, Hitler, all of them have explicitly said in one way or another, if you want to really control the people, you got to get to the children. You got to get in there early and you got to rewire their brains. And there is even something called neuroplasticity. I would encourage you to research that because if you look up neuroplasticity and you can watch videos, there's a short video out there actually about it. And it essentially talks about how your brain is, structured in such a way that you form these pathways and the things you do habitually form these really, the regular short pathways. I do it all the time becomes automatic. Okay. But we tend to think that the other pathways are fixed and that your brain can't change past a certain age, that, you can't form new habits. You can't change things that you're used to doing or used to thinking patterns, behaviors, etc. Well, we now know through brain research, that's not true. And guess who else knows it? Yeah. The people behind CASEL and SEL, they know it too. So they know that if they get the child early enough, they can use neuroplasticity to wire the children's brains to think very differently about the world, about themselves than they otherwise would, than they would being habitually exposed to mom and dad and everybody else. Because now they're going to spend, 8 hours a day in the school and they've got the most attention for this kid. Let's wire it with the thoughts we want them to have, to be the kind of people we want them to be, so that we can make the world the way we want it to be. It's quite logical, isn't it? Right? Except you have to look at what that is. What is that world they want them to be? Or what do they want to be and what's the world they want to have? Well, I'm going to show you. But to sum it up, we've talked in the channel about CRT. Well, CRT is like the software and SEL is the operating system. If they can rewire the child's brain to think of themselves a certain way and think of their role in society a certain way and their needs a certain way, then CRT makes perfect sense. That will make sense to that child. Racial essentialism will suddenly make sense. There won't be room for it to not make sense. So, when you look at CRT, you go, that doesn't make any freaking sense. That sounds racist. That's just wrong. Why does it sound wrong? Why does it sound racist to you? Because your brain was trained to use probably empiricism or so you're looking at data, you're looking at evidence, you're thinking about it logically, you're saying, but hang on a second. This sounds like you're putting, white people here and that black people can't, and that that life is a fixed pie, and you're analyzing it using one way of thinking. Skepticism, empiricism, things that are in the Western tradition, right? Take a 6-year-old or even a 10 or 12 or, people are pre-rational because you're not really fully rational until you're like 26. And you work with the wiring to say like, oh no, you're part of a group. And that's really important. And your identity as part of a group is the most important thing we need to identify very quickly. And you know what? It may not be what you think it is. And it's certainly not what your parents tell you it is. And it's certainly not what some other, traditional anything says it is. It's what you decide. And here you want to experiment with different ones. Here, let's try some different ones. Pick one. And then you affiliate with this group. And when you're part of a group, you have these obligations to the group and obligations to the society. And now the child begins to see him or herself as this very weird combination of incredibly unique, like, I made myself in a lab kind of identities, at the same time beholden to groups and focused outward, right? Focused on others, caring what others do, what others say, what others think about them and about everybody else. And it's something that people who grew up in a different world have a lot of trouble understanding because we weren't raised that way. We were told you shouldn't really care what other people think of you. We were told, you've got to take care of your own business and you're responsible for your own choices. We were told that we were going to have to literally take care of ourselves when we got out in the world and not to count on other people to be there to pick up the pieces of our, or our mistakes, that we shouldn't blame things on other people, even sometimes when they were other people's fault, because the point is to move on. The point is keep going. And that, looking backward is dumb because you're not going there and all these kinds of things. In transformative SEL, the orientation is other. The orientation is away from self. The orientation is to break down boundaries. And some of them are quite disturbing, as you probably heard about comprehensive sex ed and so forth. Yeah, so everything becomes about identity, but identity is other oriented. Identity is other oriented. Even the gender ideology is, if you think about it, it's about what they're trying to do in relation to what other people would think about their gender or their sex. It's not, say, oh, it's what I feel like, but increasing what you hear people say is, I don't want to conform to that. And it's like, but you are conforming to something else, but it's always in a reaction and a response to something perceived from the outside. And then the demand is validated. So I don't have boundaries, therefore you aren't allowed to have boundaries. And it becomes a very hostile, unpredictable world where all it takes for people to say, do what we want you to do is to just harness that group identity and say, in order to survive, you need to be with these people and do what these people are saying because other people are against you. And you can motivate literally thousands of people to just come together and do whatever the head of the group says to do. It's quite manipulative. Anyway, so let's take a look at some just some tweets, first of all, about transformative SEL and what we're finding out. The first thing I want to show you is from James Lindsay. It's a video that was captured of a Virginia education official, and she was admitting that they're using a Marxist framework in school to indoctrinate children psychologically and socially. So let me pull this up on the screen so you can see it. And I hope you'll be able to hear it. If you can't, please let me know as quickly as possible. Okay. So here's the video and let's see. I hope you can hear it.
Years that I've been here, it's inclusion for everyone.
Okay,
everyone.
You're implementing a Marxist framework.
Well, understand the Marxist framework, and you'll understand that how it's used in education, psychology, sociology today. Not all of it.
So you're admitting that it is used.
Not all of it, but that would imply that there is parts of it used. What parts are used?
Look at it up. Read it yourself.
Well, I mean, you seem to know, so could you just tell me? You seem to know.
Sociology, education, psychology. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
So did you hear her? She's saying that when you understand the Marxist framework, you'll understand how we are using it in psychology, education, and sociology. She's admitting it. She's admitting it. That's in Virginia. Youngkin has his work cut out for him. So they're admitting it, that's what they're doing. So that's that one. And then we have this. I'm going to show you, this is a little video incident report from Parents Defending Ed. going through some specific pieces of curriculum, and I think you'll get a really good sense of what's going on here.
Hi, everyone. Erica Sanzi from Parents Defending Education here. We have gotten a lot of reports recently about sexual and gender identity in school curriculum at the elementary school level. Here's just some of what we have found. First, in Howard County Public Schools in Maryland, a third grade elementary school instructional team leader and rainbow representative in the district sent an email to colleagues full of excitement about plans to, and I quote, incorporate LGBTQ within our elementary curriculum. She explicitly states that this would be integrated during SEL time. And for those watching who aren't sure of the acronym, SEL stands for Social Emotional Learning. Another email submitted is from the principal with news of a $25,000 grant to be used for advocacy work for the LGBTQ plus community for this upcoming school year, and hopes of securing a rainbow liaison at every school within HCPSS. She makes sure to clarify that this rainbow liaison would be a person separate from the DEIL, which we assume means diversity, equity, and inclusion liaison. We're talking about elementary school here. In the San Ramon Valley Unified School District of California, elementary schools have begun to introduce gender and sexuality clubs. Commonly known as GSAs or gay straight alliances at the high school level, these elementary ones are called PRISM clubs. About half the elementary schools in the district have them already, and their goal is to get one in every elementary school. One mom of an elementary schooler tells us, despite numerous requests, the district refuses to share with me the materials that are being distributed at these clubs. Lastly, in West Hartford schools in Connecticut, parents contacted us because of concern over the district's focus on group identities in grades K through 5, including transgender content in kindergarten. The standards and mentor texts are on your screen now. One parent said, I am troubled by when Aiden became a brother, which is full-on gender theory, that the sex you're assigned at birth is wrong and you're actually a boy. This is being presented as factual to very young children. Parents report that they have been told by district officials that they are not allowed to opt out of this curriculum. Parents also shared with us the documents about the redoubled district-wide efforts to engage all K-12 students in social emotional learning through an equity lens. They never define what that would look like in practice. Again, we are talking about this in kindergarten with 5- and 6-year-olds. As always, you can contact us if you have concerns or questions about what's going on at your school at defendinged.org. Thanks so much for watching. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. So that's Defending Ed. Now, I'm going to share with you some, let's see, there is a report. I think it's a report or a study. I'm not really sure what this would be called, but James Lindsay sent me this and it is quite long, so I can't read all of it to you. But what I can do is I can go through parts of it and we can talk about it. This was put out by Routledge, Taylor, and Francis Group, educational psychologists, and this is copyright 2019, American Psychological Association. Transformative Social and Emotional Learning, SEL, toward SEL in service of educational equity and excellence. Now, first of all, like I said, transformative social and emotional learning in service toward this. I think most parents send their kids to school so that the student is getting educated, right? Like it's not really in service to the education, right? Or like the system or the product. So it's kind of odd the way they frame that. And let's take a look at what it says. It says this article seeks to develop transformative social and emotional learning, SEL, a form of SEL intended to promote equity and excellence among children, young people, and adults. They're coming for you too. We focus on issues of race, ethnicity, as a first step toward addressing the broader range of extant inequities. Transformative SEL is anchored in the notion of justice-oriented citizenship. So once you are focused on justice-oriented citizenship, you're assuming there's injustice. And you're assuming that your role as a citizen is to fix it. So rather than your role being to just, live your life and maintain your civil liberties and protect civil liberties for yourself and others, your role as a citizen of the United States is to right the wrongs that have yet to be fully explained. And the premise is we live in an unjust country. This is unjust, and we need justice-oriented citizenship. That's just a really fancy academic way of saying bring about revolution. Okay. And we discuss issues of culture, identity, agency, belonging, and engagement as relevant expressions of the collaborative for academic, social, and emotional learning 5 core competencies. We also point to programs and practices that hold promise for cultivating these competencies and the importance of adult professional development in making these efforts maximally effective for diverse children and youth. Diverse basically means not white. That's the other thing to remember here, is that throughout all of this, the baseline assumption is that critical race theory is the truth. It's not just a theory, it's the truth. And what SEL is for is to allow the truth to be accepted by all the children, especially, guess who? The ones who would most likely be resistant to it, the white children, right? But also all children. I mean, there might be Black children who are resistant to the notion that they're oppressed too, okay? So it's not just white children, but especially, right? Let's see. We conclude by offering a few next steps to further advance transformative SEL research and practice. And then they go on to talk about what SEL is, pretty much what I just told you. Social and emotional learning commonly refers to a process through which children and adults acquire and effectively apply the knowledge, attitudes, and skills necessary to understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. Parents, isn't this something you thought was your job to teach? Pretty much. And that what you hoped the school would do was just not get in your way, like reinforce good things like this, like, maintain sort of maintain the classroom and kids aren't, hurting each other, and they're respectful to the adults, respectful to each other. They get their work done on time, teach them some study skills, don't interfere with their respect for their parents and all that. Didn't you kind of think of it like that? No, that's not what it is. Although much is known about the influences and impacts of SEL efforts, are you ready? There are still substantial gaps in our understanding of whether and in what ways SEL programs and approaches can best advance optimal academic, social, and emotional competence development of all children, youth, and adults. This right here is an admission that they actually don't have data to back any of this up. Much is known about it, but there's still substantial gaps. But let's keep going. There are substantial gaps about how these programs can best advance these goals, but let's keep doing it. And that's part of what this paper is like, oh, here's how we can research for it. But it's with a very specific goal, remember? The specific goal of justice-oriented citizenship. So do you think the research they're going to look at to fill the gaps is going to be objective? You think it'll be empirical? I'm thinking no. I mean, I don't know. Call me crazy. And then it says, for example, Jones et al. 2019 asserted that a research agenda for the next generation must necessarily include increased precision in constructs and associated measures within a developmental progression, a better understanding of the nature and processes for training and professional development of educators that leads to high quality implementation, attention to the influences and impacts of integrated social, emotional, and academic learning at the level of the student and settings, e.g. school, family, extended learning, and last but not least, whether and what ways such efforts can contribute to more equitable learning experiences and outcomes for children, youth, and adults from diverse backgrounds and circumstances. We don't really know how to do this or what we're doing, but we still need to pursue this goal. And by the way, we need to make sure it goes outside the classroom, and we need to train the teachers better to do it, but let's start doing it anyway. they're admitting the teachers aren't really trained to do this. They don't really know how this stuff works inside and out of the classroom. They need to better understand it, but okay. And then it says this article builds on our recent efforts to help advance the research agenda for the next generation by focusing on SEL in the service of equity and excellence. They never do define for us what excellence would look like. I'm really curious what excellence would look like. Scholars and practitioners have raised important questions about whether guiding frameworks, prominent programs, and associated assessments adequately reflect, cultivate, and leverage cultural assets and promote the optimal well-being of young people, especially those from communities of color and under-resourced backgrounds. Now, remember something. When you see words like especially those from these communities or especially these kids, we are talking about public schools. There's not supposed to be any especially about it. Let me advance a radical notion to you. If it truly benefits a child who happens to look like me, it will also benefit a child who is Black or Hispanic or Asian or any other child. There is not some separate objective truth based on your skin color. There is not some separate set of data about what benefits students who have different skin colors. Now, if you want to talk about you want to isolate culture, and you got to be really careful when you do this. Really careful. Are you talking again about the culture associated with the skin color? Because you've already failed. Are you talking about culture related to socioeconomic status? You're getting closer. You're getting warmer. Okay. But you're going to have to get pretty darn narrow. And then you're bumping up against ethical quandaries. Like, how can you really test without it being unethical? Right? You don't want to experiment on a specific subset of children. They shouldn't be experimenting on children, period, which, by the way, all of this is. They admit they don't really have, there's a lot of gaps in their understanding about what this does to children. I can guess that, breaking down boundaries and putting barriers between parents and children in terms of telling them that like what mom and dad are telling you is false is probably not great for their mental health, and their identity, especially when they're 6, 7, and 8. When their identity pretty much derives from home. But they're admitting they don't really know. So, anytime you see especially, you're already dealing with discrimination, and you're already dealing with people who are taking a racial essentialist, very stereotype, like they're stereotyping children based on their membership in a racial or ethnic community. And that's just not a good way to go about thinking about education. When we have immigrants who come to this country, and if they're educated, if they move into, let's say, a classical school, and attention is paid, let's say, to their English language learning skills, something obvious, something that is objective, like they need to learn English, okay? But beyond that, they're taught the same way as their peers, and they do really, really well. In other words, like there's no organic issue there that we're not dealing with learning disabilities or something like that. And we deal with the English language learning. They manage to learn the same way and just as well as the kids who don't look like them. That's, to me, plenty of evidence, empirical evidence, that we don't need to be subdividing these groups and saying, well, let's see how we benefit, especially this group. No. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead because there's so much down here, but let's take a look at this. Okay, it says transformative SEL represents an as yet underutilized approach that SEL researchers and practitioners can use if they seek to effectively address issues such as power, privilege, prejudice, discrimination, social justice, empowerment, and self-determination. In essence, we argue that for SEL to adequately serve those from underserved communities, again, the presumption is they're underserved. Define served. Define what properly served looks like, and then we can decide if they're underserved. But when they toss things around like underserved, that puts the onus on the community to serve, not on the individuals to learn or show up or anything like that. And I don't know what the equation is, but define served before you tell me they're underserved. and promote the optimal developmental outcomes for all children, youth, and adults. It must cultivate in them the knowledge. It must cultivate in them a knowledge. Can you cultivate knowledge? Think about that. Do we cultivate knowledge, or do we teach? Do we present knowledge that then has to be integrated by the child, learned and integrated? We don't cultivate knowledge. Cultivate knowledge is a fancy, fancy way of hoodwinking you into thinking that indoctrination is a good thing. Let me cultivate your knowledge that this is so. I'm cultivating. I'm telling it to you over and over. Did you know that your sex was just assigned to you at birth? Let's cultivate. Let's till that soil, plant, water, cultivate. Okay, that is not the same thing as teaching. And then it says the knowledge, attitudes, and skills required for critical examination and collaborative action. Collaborative action. That's the goal of education. Did you know? Collaborative action to address root causes of inequities. There it is. There you go. Transformative SEL represents an as yet underutilized approach that SEL researchers and practitioners, that means teachers, can use to brainwash. That's the sum that is what that paragraph says. Because cultivating knowledge is what that is. Toward this end, Transformative SEL is aimed at educational equity, fostering more equitable learning environments and producing equitable outcomes. Equitable outcomes. I'm going to just let that hang in the air. We need to start doing a better job of demanding the answer to the question, why are equitable outcomes desirable? Why? I saw on Twitter the other day, and I thought it was great. Somebody said, diversity, all people are different. People are different, unique, individual. Equity, they shouldn't be. They should all be the same and have the same outcomes. Inclusion, we're going to discriminate until we get to equity. I thought that was brilliant and accurate. They don't mean to include. They don't. Inclusion is just another form of, word game where that means we're going to validate the ideas and the people we need to validate in order to subjugate whoever we need to subjugate so that we can achieve, equitable amounts of stuff in everybody's hands when we're done. But that's what they're looking for. Producing equitable outcomes for children and young people furthest from opportunity. Well, again, furthest from opportunity. Measure that, please. What does opportunity look like? And are these children all not in a school? So they're all in the same building. They're there. How are they far from the opportunity presented by that school? And why is it the responsibility of the other children in the class to get them closer to it? Why is that not the responsibility of the institution and the teachers or their parents or some combination thereof? Fostering this kind of stuff in the environment is another code way of saying all the children who are, as we define it, close to opportunity have an obligation to step on back. This educational equity implies that every student has what he or she needs when they need it, regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, language, disability, family background, or family income. Again, who's assessing what an individual child needs? And why are we attaching needs to those other factors? Why do you assume that a Black child has different needs by default than a white child? Just because of that one fact. Or even a kid who is white and their parents are doctors, and the child who is Black and their parents are, restaurant workers or something different. Okay, they're not in the same socioeconomic class. Why do you assume their academic needs are automatically different? And furthermore, why do you assume that the white child has fewer of them? That's the assumption that they're making, regardless of these factors. What they need when they need it. Well, think about the average teacher. Do you think that teacher is qualified to diagnose the individual, complicated little intersections of needs of 30 different kids? You think they're capable of that? Do you think they're well enough trained for that? Or do you think it's more likely they're going to walk into the class and make blanket assumptions because they can once this framework is in place? Remember that the ideas can sound really pretty on paper, but when a teacher who's trained to be a teacher, an elementary school teacher, let's say, they're not exactly, they're not PhDs in psychology. They're not PhDs in social science. They don't have degrees in economics. They don't understand the many, 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 many disciplines that would affect each individual child. And even if they did, that is a hell of a job. That's a hell of a job. That's not what they're tasked to do. That's not what they should be tasked to do. What they should be tasked to do is go in and find the best possible way for all the children, like do the best you can to present the material in such a way that the vast majority of children can access it. And if they can't, then you provide them with extra help. Instead, they want to look at these kids and make all kinds of assumptions based on race, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, and all these things. And somebody somewhere is going to decide exactly what they need, exactly when they need it. Who's doing that? And how are they doing that? These are questions we need answers to. And then we say, this includes examining biases and replacing inequitable practices with those that lend themselves to fertile, inclusive, multicultural learning environments that cultivate the interests and talents of children, youth, and adults from diverse backgrounds. Why are we assuming that their interests would be so different? Just because they have different backgrounds? Why are we assuming that? Doesn't that sound like a bias that ought to be examined? And replacing inequitable practices, like what? Can you give us some examples? What's an inequitable practice? I never get answers to these questions. They just say they're replacing inequitable practices, and everybody goes, yes, we should definitely do that. Okay, what would those be? And then sometimes you'll get people who'll be honest and say, like grading. Not everybody gets the same grade. Like, not everybody deserves the same grade. Why don't you ask whether we should be giving grades at all? That's a conversation we can have. But if you're going to give grades, you don't just give everyone the same grade. That doesn't make any sense. So is that an inequitable practice because people didn't end up in the same place? Is it? I don't think that's how we define it, but that's how they define it. So moving on. Let's see. In this article, we focus on issues of SEL and educational equity with regard to race. Ethnicity is a critical first step. So you see, race is the first step. Okay. To specify how SEL might be leveraged in the service of equity for a range of minoritized people within U.S. social system. Did you know we have a social system? I didn't know we had a social system. That's news to me. I wasn't aware of that. Okay. Good to know. Racialized oppression was foundational to the establishment of the United States and persists as a vexing, I'm very vexed, a vexing unresolved cluster of problems for sizable portions of the population. Well, that's your opinion. That's your opinion. That racialized oppression was foundational, first of all. That's your opinion, that it was foundational to the founding. That's obviously 1619 Project worming its way into the mindset of this individual. And then, as if it's an accepted fact. Because racial oppression happened is not the same thing as saying it was foundational to the founding of the country. I hope everybody understands the difference. And then let's see, what else do they assert in there? That it's, it still persists. Racialized oppression persists. Again, another opinion. It's an opinion. These things are not established facts. And then it says, along with well-known projections that the United States will be a minority-majority nation in less than 3 decades, is the reality that an increasing number of school-age children and youth reside in poor or low-income families and communities. And they do. But there are factors nobody's examining in this. They're centering everything in the school. And the school is the place to fix this. And the school is going to train the children to see this problem and be angry about this problem and be activists for this problem. Not thinking that maybe there are a few dozen other factors that could be causing this. And maybe it's not really a cause. It's just a state of affairs when you have, let's say, a large immigrant population who had to come to the country and leave everything behind and they're starting off with nothing. That might be a factor. Maybe you have, English language learning issues, and that's a factor. In other words, it's not necessarily oppression. There are lots of things going on. High taxation, the rearrangement of the industrial, engine of the country from one section of the country to another part of the country to overseas, realignments of how our economy is even functioning post-COVID. I mean, dozens, literally. But no, it's attitudes and the classroom environment. That's what it is. And if we just fix that, then everything will be better. But of course, they're not trying to fix it so that the kids get a better education. They're trying to fix it so that they become better activists. Racial, ethnic inequalities in education are linked with other inequalities such as health, wealth, and thereby compromise the life chances of these children and youth. Again, correlation is not causation. And if you're going to look at correlations that are really high, illiteracy is number one. You want equity of outcome or something close to it? Make sure all the kids can read. Make sure they can all read. Maybe spend 0 time on this and 100% of time on making sure the kids can read by 3rd grade. And quite possibly fewer kids will end up impoverished. Turning them into political activists who aren't very good readers and don't do math very well, but they're good and angry, is probably not going to lift them up from wherever they are in the socioeconomic scale. I mean, I could be wrong. I'm not a social scientist, but that would be my common sense guess. And then they're saying this ultimately undermines the vitality of their communities and threatens the nation's security. You know what threatens the nation's security? Teaching Marxism in the school, making kids angry activists in the school, making them hate their country, hate the adults they live with, their parents, hate everything that came before, be completely ignorant of how society was built and civilization functions. Teach them that they need to tear everything down that's in front of them without having any skills to build it back up. And that there's really nothing good about this country worth saving. I would say that's a greater threat to our security than whatever this nonsense is that they're talking about. But again, your mileage may vary. This article is derived in part from a larger scan of the literature that Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, otherwise known as CASEL, that is one of the biggest companies that puts this stuff out, is conducting. Such scans are done periodically to guide updates to CASEL tool and resources. The ongoing effort is anchored in CASEL's current strategic foci of equity, adult SEL, and integration of academic and SEL instruction. So they're training the teachers too. And then, of course, this is making its way through DEI into your workplace and so on. We seek to further advance this work in several ways. First, we articulate the cultural and historical context for understanding the relationship between SEL and equity. That's pretty straightforward. It's, if I can brainwash you into believing that everything needs to be equal, then you will pursue things being equal. There you go. In addition, we employ notions of democracy and citizenship to help further frame the concept of transformative SEL. Third, we discuss how expression of culture, identity, agency, belonging, and engagement can fit in with the 5 buckets represented by the CASEL 5 core competencies and in themselves have the potential to compose transformative social and emotional competencies. Don't you love how they use the word competency? Like, if you don't do things this way, you're incompetent. That these are skills that you can measure. A competency is something theoretically that you can measure. Can you measure this stuff? They've already admitted that they don't have much in the way of measurement. We then point to programs and practices that hold promise. They hold promise. We don't know, though, for cultivating and integrating these transformative competencies in the context of academic learning. That's code for we're going to put it in every class in the school. They want to look for programs that put it in every program in the school and all the academic subjects. In doing so, we highlight the importance of professional development. I'm sure you have to retrain the teachers, no doubt. That includes adult SEL, brainwashing of the teachers who are already in a helping field, who are already thinking about, they love their kids. They do. They love the students. Most of them, some of them hate them, but I mean, those who are committed really went into teaching because they do care about children and they convince them that this is going to help the kids. And tragically, many of them are not well versed in what's behind this stuff either. and they don't understand necessarily that they're doing something wrong. They think they're doing something good. Okay. So let's see, situating equity and SEL in a cultural historical context. Are you ready? Just get ready to cringe because this is going to make you puke. In the United States and many other westernized societies, there are dominant cultural themes of individualism and materialism that suggest that the primary meaning of maturity, success, and happiness is defined as being self-sufficient, autonomous, and financially well off. Did you think those things were a problem? Because they do. I was sort of hoping my kids would grow up to be these things. Now, maybe not well off. They don't have to be specifically well off, but how about just self-sufficient? How about able to take care of themselves? How about reasonably financially secure? And autonomous for sure. Definitely wanted that. Didn't want them dependent on anybody because that's not very safe. But okay, although this orientation has brought about technological advances that improve the basic material conditions for many, it also fosters elevated levels of greed, avarice, utilitarianism, and unethical behaviors. Oh, Lord knows that socialism doesn't promote anything resembling greed or any kind of corruption or any kind of unethical behaviors like purging entire populations of people in death camps. No, of course not. That never happens. No. Just this orientation is so greedy. Yeah. These people are not greedy at all. Not at all. The DEI people who make six figures and command six figures per, like pay me $25,000, says Kendi, for a 15-minute talk. But no, we're not greedy. Definitely not. Okay. Let's see. This has in turn brought about the concentration of wealth in the hands of a decreasing percentage of people across the globe, a shrinking middle class. The shrinking middle class is because of the growth of government. We've learned that. If we learned nothing in the last 2 years, please tell me that we have learned that the shrinking middle class is a function of the government telling us that we aren't doing enough for everybody else, namely them. Here's your Marxism right here. Here it is. And expanding the number of working poor and poor. The iniquities and sense of unrealized material aspirations. Well, boo-hoo. I'm sorry. I have unrealized material aspirations. That's not anybody else's fault. Whose fault is that? Mine. Okay. And socioeconomic precarity have social and emotional implications such as self-destructive and internecine conflict and violence. That is a myth. This is where they get the, if you're poor, you're violent. If you're poor, you're unhappy. If you're, one of the working poor, everything is going to be worse for you. That's just not true. Doesn't mean everything's wine and roses, but it's implying that people who are better off are just blissfully happy all the time and don't have any of these problems. There's no violence in their lives. There's just, everything's great. And the people who are poor are just utterly miserable and constantly afflicted with violence. There are some statistical averages that show that there's more of that in some of these communities, but it's not a given. It's not a given, and it's quite insulting, actually. So again, they're making a lot of gross generalizations that conveniently support their arguments. Most pronounced among boys and men of color from under-resourced communities, and increasingly by low-income and working-class white men. Are they now concerned about working-class white men? Are they now concerned about that? Further, this cultural orientation helped launch, sustain, and exacerbate long-standing racial, class, and gender stereotypes that define prevailing notions of in-group, out-group relations. I could not disagree more. In fact, what we have seen in the past 50 years, at least up until the current critical race theory nonsense, is improvements, dramatic improvements in racial, class, and gender relationships. Radical improvements. We have female CEOs. We have acceptance of gay marriage. We have many. We have so many families that are mixed race marriages, mixed race entire families. We have blended families. We have all kinds of things that even just when I was a child, people would have been like, that are now so commonplace, we don't even think about it anymore. The improvements are dramatic. Just in the last 25 years, it's been a sea change. And they're acting like, oh no, this individualism is no, I would say the opposite. The opposite, respect for individual liberty, is what has enabled us to make that kind of progress. The ability to make an argument like, what do you care who I love? This is none of your business. Oh, you're right. Boom, done. Okay. I mean, it wasn't that easy. I'm just saying that is the argument. Not, you're a member of this group and you need to do this and do that. It's what's making it harder and actually creating in-group and out-group friction is racial essentialism. They're claiming the exact opposite of what is true. These stereotypes further inequities by allowing dominant groups, especially upper income white people, to affix blame on the disadvantage for their life circumstances, justify unearned privilege, and engage in dehumanization, commodification, and marginalization of large segments of the domestic and international populations. Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't aware that our school children were responsible for international populations. Did you know that? Yes, it's on my list of to-dos, by the way, is the New World Order song. So did you know that your school child is responsible for, getting rid of these stereotypes that they claim exist? The only people I see stereotyping are these people. These people behind this stuff. Okay. So this goes on and on. I can't read all of it, but here's what I want to show you. I'm not even going to look at this. This is the most important thing to show you is this. And I don't know that you can see it. I'm going to try to zoom in more because you really need to be able to see this. I think this is better. Okay. So what we had before in terms of the tentative list of relevant concepts, constructs for forms of social emotional learning. So what I told you in the beginning, as far as forms of social emotional learning, is we had, didn't mean to do that. We had the concept of personally responsible. Right? This is under self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. I bet nobody in this audience, and I wouldn't dispute that all of these things are important. Self-awareness is important. Self-management is important. Social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making all contribute to the ability of a human being to thrive. If you have these things and you're good at them, okay, you're going to do better in life. No matter what, you could be the most skilled reader, or you could be illiterate. If you have these, you're probably going to do a little better than you otherwise would do. All right. But America, like Americans, probably parents, when you had children, you thought like, well, the ones I want my kids to have are going to fall under this personally responsible category. Most likely, maybe the next one, but let's talk about that. Personally responsible. Acquisitive individualism. Well, they're making it sound bad, but it just means I'm going to go get for myself what I need. Okay. And I'm going to get things. You may want to encourage your children to want fewer things, be less acquisitive. That's fine. That's a value thing. But the idea is that I go get my own stuff. All right. Then identity. This is how the personally responsible identity sees itself. Private regard. In other words, I have personal pride in myself and, whatever. Exploration and resolution. So I'm going to maybe explore that and then resolve it within myself and, but it's me. I'm aware of myself. Self-management, emotion-focused coping, agency, right? I'm responsible. I can do things. Resilience, fall down, get back up, and social efficacy. All right. So I'm out there being social and I'm effective with it. Social awareness, public regard. So, that you regard other people and they regard you and you have a certain respect for that. Belonging, well, that you have access to places to belong, people to belong with, and so forth. Okay. Access is you're personally responsible, though, to go make use of whatever access you have or to gain access. Relationship skills, engagement, sharing, helping. Okay. The basics. Responsible decision-making, interpersonal justice, okay, between a couple people, acculturation. I want to fit in with, whatever the culture is and not stand out too much, at least in terms of my decision-making. And then my personal well-being. I'm going to take care of myself. All right. This seems pretty straightforward. Well, now let's go over to participatory. You have a communal orientation. So now you're oriented towards the community. Your identity, you still have private regard, exploration, resolution, but with a communal orientation. Like what can I do, or what I do has an impact on others. Emotion-focused coping, agency, resilience, social efficacy, and now civic advocacy. Now you're getting into, the left-hand column might be somebody who's like, if you want to align this with politics, the middle column might be a little more of the sort of Democrats. Okay. Like I have a responsibility to, take care of others and be mindful of my civic engagement. Okay. A little bit more. And there are plenty of Republicans who do too. I'm just generalizing. Okay. Public regard, belonging. Now we have inclusion. We want to go out of our way. We want to include people. We want to be included. And diversity salient. So the participatory mindset is this diverse enough? Am I in a diverse enough place? I need to diversify my environment. I need to get more people around me who look different, have different points of view. I need to diversify. Interestingly, these same people aren't too interested in diversifying point of view. They're perfectly fine with absolute homogeneity of point of view, but they want people to look different. And then we have the cultural competence. So it's not enough to just do, engagement, sharing, and helping. Now you want to go out of your way to be culturally competent, understand other people's cultures, and that's part of SEL. And then procedural justice, not just interpersonal justice. Now you're really focused on what the justice processes are for other people and how they resolve their issues. And you're kind of now looking at how other people are solving their problems and very concerned about it. Assimilation. So how do I assimilate into the group? How do I fit in with others? And collective well-being. I don't really feel all that well if you don't feel well. So you start to see how this is going. Well, wait till we get to transformative. Communal orientation, identity, centrality. Centrality. This is central. Your identity is central to who you are. You still have private regard, but your identity is front and center. Exploration, resolution. But now we have critical self-analysis. So we're a narcissist, but we're constantly criticizing and making sure that we're doing the work to be, whatever we're supposed to be in the community. Problem-focused coping. Interesting. Sounds like we're looking for problems to solve. Cultural humility. Oh, my culture may not be as good as your culture, etc. I mean, this implies that people over here are these arrogant assholes, like that because I don't walk around actively considering whether I have cultural humility, I have none. That's just ridiculous. Okay. But they want to actively cultivate this. And what cultural humility is actually is like kind of dog on your own culture. Unless, of course, you're one of the, downtrodden cultures, then that's okay. Agency, resistance. To what? What are we resisting now? And now we have moral. We have moral in here. What? You want the school teaching your kids morals and resistance? This is where activism lives. Civic advocacy. So we're still focused on that. And now collective advocacy. This again is activism. Got to work as a group. Belonging co-owner. Nobody owns anything. So I belong, but I co-own all my stuff and on my feelings and everything. Diversity salience, situational and institutional. So not just where you put yourself, but also the institutions around you. You should be very critical if they're not diverse enough. Critical social analysis. Yeah, this means tear shit down. Engagement, multicultural competence. So it's not enough to just be competent in your culture or the culture in which you live. You've got to have competence in multiple cultures. As if you're living in multiple cultures when we live in one country at a time, don't we? And then we have sharing, helping, collaborative problem solving, leadership, distributive justice. What's that? What's distributive justice? Interesting. Pluralism and collective well-being again. This entire column of transformative SEL is Marxism. It does. This is an idea that builds an army. Okay. So, and then here we go. This nails it. When fear is established, kids grow up being obedient to authority and defend their cult no matter what, devoid of independent thought and critical thinking outside their myopic view of tribalism. Yes, that is correct. And then let's see, examples of program and approaches to forms of social emotional learning. So over here, we would have had skill development, risk prevention, and competence promotion. Oh, the horror. I can see why they wouldn't want that anymore. And then participatory classroom community building, multicultural education, and service learning. I'm not a giant fan of this junk, but I mean, most of us, when we send our kids, if we sent your kids to public school, you probably expected that. You probably were like, all right. Unless you picked a classical school, in which case you expected the stuff in the left-hand column, and maybe there'd be a little dose of some community things and maybe some service projects, but not required. When my kids were in public school, it was absolutely required. They had to do volunteer hours, lots of them, or they couldn't graduate. That where I come from is called slave labor. But you know, if your diploma is being held hostage to you going and working for free for like 100 hours, that strikes me as child labor without pay. So, but you know, I'm a weird one. Transformative wants you to do culturally relevant education as defined by them, with the cultures they think are relevant. Project-based learning, which by the way, at my opinion as an educator, is crap. Absolute crap. Total crap. Total crap. Completely rejects human nature, completely rejects the reality on the ground, which is not every student is going to be equally competent at the academic components of the project. So you're going to have one or two kids who are doing all the work and the rest are going to sit back and collect the grade and not do anything. And thus we teach that, you know, to each according to his ability and right? That's how we do it. We get them ready to carry the water and pull the wagon for the lazy and the weak and the incompetent, until such time as they wake up and realize they're sick and tired of doing it and nobody's pulling the wagon. The wagon's going nowhere and civilization collapses. Youth participatory action research, that's a very fancy way of saying finding new ways to become a youth activist. But that's what that is. That's what that is. And this goes on. I mean, you know, then they talk about the different competencies. What I'm most interested in is how they define identity. Who you are based on both self-definition and others' perceptions connotes relative advantage or disadvantage. Does it? Based on my self-definition and others' perceptions? Okay. Helps to inform whether citizenship is contested. Well, that's true. And determines the nature of one's citizenship strivings and experiences. Strivings. Okay. This implicates most directly the castle competencies of self-awareness and social awareness, but weaves through the other competencies as well. Culture, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and gender continue to be used as determinants of social status, and thus are key defining aspects of identity in the United States and across the globe. They keep talking about the United States as if we are some kind of old-fashioned European country where somebody you meet is sitting there checking off a bunch of boxes about you and putting you in a box and saying, okay, now here you are. I've evaluated you based on these things. And if you look around and you look at the evidence, there just isn't evidence that that's happening. One of the benefits of the United States, one of the reasons we continue to attract immigrants from all over the globe is that we don't really have that. We really don't. We still do, in very, very large part, evaluate people on what the heck they're doing, more so than what they are or who they are. Much more so. So if somebody is hardworking and showing up and bringing it and adding value and so on, then that's usually how they're evaluated for the most part. Now, does that mean there are no situations and no environments where somebody might judge them based on other factors? Of course not. But that's not the same thing as saying the country, the society as a whole. There always are and always will be situations where certain people based on ridiculous arbitrary criteria are not welcome. There are clubs in Washington, D.C. for crying out loud where Republicans aren't welcome and Democrats aren't welcome and women aren't welcome and men aren't welcome. I mean, these places still exist. But that's not the same thing as American society. And honestly, I'm not sure I want to live in a country that would ban that. Like, go ahead. I don't, like Groucho Marx said, I don't want to belong to a club that wouldn't have me as a member. So they're conflating these two things. And at the same time, they want to have affinity groups, go figure. So those things are bad. Those where they judge you and say, we don't want any women here. We don't want this here. We don't want men here, whatever. Women's only, men's only. That's bad. But we need the white affinity group and the black affinity group. And we need the trans groups and the LGBT groups and the rainbow groups and that group. I mean, it's just some groups are more equal than other groups. And they just, this whole look at how long they go on about identity. And then here's intersectionality, which of course they agree with. Given that transformative SEL advances equity and excellence, we see the nexus of racial, ethnic identity, academic identity, and disciplinary identification is one of the more productive lines of inquiry. Disciplinary identification? For example, research has shown that having a positive sense of one's racial identity can buffer Black students against school-based discrimination and support one's academic success. Research shows that. And I bet there's also research that shows that in environments where you don't pay any attention to race, the students also do really well, possibly better. So they've cherry-picked a study here. I'd love to take a look at that study. Maybe Adrian can take a look at that study for us and tell us if that's a legit study, because I find that actually very hard to believe. Positive racial, I mean, no one wants you to have a negative racial identity, but why should you have a racial identity at all? How does that improve your life long term? And then we have other work has shown that many students' pervasive notions of being a good student include conformity and compliance, and that this is inconsistent with the type of sustained, creative, collaborative, scholarly participation, consumer, critic, producer required for them to approximate scientists and engineers in STEM disciplines. I've never met anyone who did well in school who didn't think of themselves as a good student. You need to do that. You do. You have to first believe that you can before you can. Alignment across the aspects and elements of identity is pivotal to transformative SEL. So you see what they're saying. If you don't have alignment across identity and intersectionality, then you can't do transformative SEL. So there you go. And then this goes on and on and on. I'm going to go to the end of this and see what they say as a conclusion. Or next, I don't want to read all the next steps, but let's see what we get to. Next steps. Sorry. This article represents an effort to establish and flesh out transformative SEL as an approach that we believe to have merit if researchers, practitioners, and other stakeholders are interested in advancing equity and excellence in education. The effort was informed by CASEL's strategic foci, and our assertion on a transformative form of SEL generates a number of positive next steps. One immediate set of considerations has to do with CASEL tools and resources. As we further sharpen the conceptualization of multiple forms of SEL, we will need to turn attention to how these advances are represented in, for example, the CASEL framework. We will also wrestle with ways in which this expanded SEL framework might best be reflected in the CASEL program review and other popular resources and tools. That's the stuff that's going into our schools right now. CRE, they talk about CRE, that's culturally relevant education, which is, or culturally responsive, which is also CRT. And check it out. Support for this manuscript was provided by Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and the University of Michigan. So there you have that. I will put a link to, well, I can't, this is a PDF. So I'm trying to think if there's a way to upload PDF somewhere for you guys to see. Well, here it is. Educational Psychologist, Transformative Social and Emotional Learning, SEL toward SEL in service of education, equity and excellence. And like I said, it's 25 pages. Obviously couldn't read all of it to you today. That would be crazy long. But I hope you kind of get the point that transformative takes it way beyond even the SEL that I was telling you is a problem, because this is finding its way, as Erica Sanzi pointed out, into all kinds of classes, all the way down to kindergarten. You will see it pop up not just in terms of gender identity, gender ideology, or even critical race theory. It's not just in English class. It's not just in history class. This is popping up in science and in math. They are taking the kids' temperature all the time as far as how they're feeling, which parent is their favorite, how they get along with people at home, all those surveys. You should definitely be getting with your school and opting your children out of any surveys related to Castle or any of these other companies that are doing this. And unfortunately, though, in most states, you can't opt your kid out of SEL. You can't say, I want my kid out of the SEL lessons. The best you can do is opt them out of questionnaires and surveys. But you can't, once it's baked in to the lesson plan, you can't get them out. And there are lots and lots of lesson plans. What they're doing is they're putting this stuff as a priority above everything else. Feelings and reactions and reflections are top of mind for all these teachers, not skill development. And the reason I say that is I see it in my tutoring. I'm having parents coming to me and hiring me to tutor their kids, not because there's a concept they don't understand, not because they not because they're behind in a particular subject, but because they're worried they're actually not learning their core subjects, most specifically English and reading and history and things like that, writing. And then I look at the material they have in school and I want to cry. The books that they're reading, the readings they're given, the way they force them to jump around and have everything relate to identity, everything relates somehow to justice, this concept of justice. Imagine you're going to spend the majority of your childhood where every single day you're hearing the word justice literally dozens of times. And the framing is you live in an unjust country and injustice is all around you. And injustice lives in systems of power and oppression that uphold white people specifically. And that until you dismantle those systems of oppression, you can't have justice. And people will always be oppressed. And we can't achieve this wonderful, whatever it is, utopia that we're supposed to achieve. We never tell you what that's going to look like or how it's going to work. But we can't do that till you work real hard on, being aware of it and being committed to the work, being committed to your civic engagement and your resistance to the oppression. Now imagine you're hearing that over and 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 over. And every subject you learn is through that lens. You learn European history a little through that. These horrible people, what they did. You learn American history through that. These things happened, but isn't it terrible? Isn't it awful? Don't you see why we now need to tear it all down? This country was just foundationally grounded in oppression and racism, and it's all terrible. Anything good it's terrible. We don't discuss the good. Literature. They're reading a lot of struggle literature. They're reading a lot of very painful stories that in and of themselves, I have a 7th grader reading a book about it's touching the spirit bear or something. And it's about something called Circle Justice. It's about a 15-year-old boy who's growing up in an abusive household. And he's so violent by the time he's 15, he's just beating people up. And rather than go to jail, he chooses to go live alone on an island in Alaska, but it's all a fraud. He's just, he doesn't care. He just doesn't want to go to jail. And when you read the description of him, is his attitude towards the adults, his attitude towards everybody, you're just like, he's not a sympathetic character. Like you barely feel sorry for him. That's how little they describe the scenario, other than his dad was a drunk and hit him, which is terrible. But the implication, if you're a 7th grade kid not growing up in that environment, is the people like that are justified in just pummeling people, and now we need to give them some kind of justice. And he's just not. I mean, I haven't read all the way through the book, but I'm just thinking to myself, why are they reading this? There's so many stories they could be reading. I hope there's some redemption at the end. I really do. But it's so dark. It's so dark so far. And I just don't know what they're trying to cultivate in these kids. I really don't. Lots and lots of struggle literature, victim literature. And even when you read it, you get the sense that it's not so much about somebody rising above something individually and saying, you know what, they can't touch me because I'm going to go on and I'm going to triumph, like a Frederick Douglass story, right? It's more like I'm going to carry this resentment and revenge and hate and anger, like forever, because they deserve it. And I'm justified to feel the way I do because people suck. And that's just, I don't think what we want our kids learning. So it's kind of baked into everything. And even the questions they ask, how does racism impact this? Or in what ways does oppression factor in here? Not does oppression factor in, or what role do you think the individual plays? No, it's just go and identify the problem, problematize everything, find the problems. And then what are you going to do about it, small child? And they actually solicit answers from kids. People should do more. These kids don't understand how things work in real life. So they get them fantasizing about utopian solutions very early. They present big, complicated problems in literature and history and so forth, and then solicit opinions from the children who haven't learned enough background knowledge. And that, like I said, teaches them that their opinions are as valid as anybody else's. Well, no wonder you're going to get to 12th grade and be very frustrated that the adults haven't fixed everything. So, and that's what they're trying to do here. They want to break down any sense of self that they might get at home, any sense of personal autonomy and responsibility and boundaries that keeps the group or the outside world in its proper place. Like, don't make demands on me. I don't owe you anything. I don't owe you validation. I don't owe you my time. I don't owe you my allegiance. I don't owe you anything. I am an autonomous individual living in the United States of America. No, I'm sorry, you're not, little child. This is your role. That's what transformative justice seeks to do. So, do you guys have any questions about any of this stuff before I go? Willing to, not that I am the foremost expert in the world on this. Mostly this was an introduction to it. Let me see. I just got a note from Kelly. I was going to see if she could jump on and maybe address some of this stuff too. But we'll talk about it more. I'll definitely talk about it more. So let's see. What are you asking? They don't mention the type of child. I'm just looking through here. Oh, this is a really good point. It's promoting nihilism, and we wonder why kids have mental health issues. Yes. Because, after a point, when you focus so much on the negative and on struggle, the child is going to start thinking like, what does it matter? What matter? Why should I bother? So you get a lot of why should I bother? So you get kids who are like, I'm going to go out there and fix everything and struggle. And then you get the ones that go, what's the point? I mean, what's the point? For example, how much self-hatred do you have that you coerce others to say correct pronouns to feel better about yourself? They're teaching kids to reduce themselves from your pronoun choices. Yes, very much so. Let's see if I've got anything else. When I was in school, I had a teacher tell the class that the Klan still existed, but said there is no equivalent for Blacks anymore. See, and those are those things that, like, I wonder about teachers when they do stuff like that. Yes, the Klan exists like this. I mean, I have no power at all. And as far as no equivalent, Nation of Islam, anyone? I mean, they're not necessarily, but the Klan's not burning crosses either. Not to minimize it. There's, I wish there weren't a Klan, but I also wish there weren't Nation of Islam and Louis Farrakhan and his anti-Semitic, anti-white, anti-everything, rhetoric. So I don't get why they do this. I mean, there just isn't currently any institutional support for overt racism. There really isn't institutional support for covert racism, except this stuff. This is racist. This is setting extremely low standards for the kids they're calling, marginalized or whatever. That's racist to me. They're changing math around allegedly to help kids, and they're not helping kids. They're making it harder for them to excel. Here's another one. SEL goes in conjunction with masking children. They reduce kids to see individual person as a vector of disease, blaming others constantly. Yes, it's all connected. You're absolutely right. These are not separate things. These are not separate things. Yep, they're the ones that have the pronouns. They go together. It's part of the overall philosophy that, people either see themselves as individuals and who, as I said, feel that it's civically, they're not thinking I live on an island and I can do whatever I want. They're not hedonists, okay? Or even narcissists. Just the most civic minded thing I can do is take care of myself. Then I'm not a burden to anybody else. That personal responsibility can be very civically responsible. And I think most Americans, certainly if you go back in the history of this country, if you go back to like the greatest generation, that's probably what they would have told you. And if you even go back to the Depression, people were super proud. It was considered a dark, dark day in the life of the average man if he had to go down and sign up to get some kind of public assistance. To have to admit that you had to get help from somebody else was not something a person wanted to do. It was a source of personal pride that you didn't need that. People were selling apples rather than doing that, planting victory gardens and doing all kinds of odd jobs. Plenty of people were going around being hobos rather than trying to go and beg, like literally just living in the park and doing things like that. So I don't mean to romanticize it. I'm just saying that there was just a sense of pride that I don't want to do that. I don't want to ask for government assistance. And somehow that's all gone. You still have people who feel that way. You still have people say, no way, I'm not signing up for an EBT card. I'll get 5 jobs. I will work my fingers to the bone before I do that. That person still exists. You're looking at one. I've been in some pretty low places in my life as far as my economic circumstances. And I had like 3 and 4 jobs rather than I qualified. I could have gone and signed up for things and I didn't do it because I just couldn't do it. Just couldn't do it. And people say, well, you paid into it. You did that. And I'm like, yeah, okay, fine, super. I didn't want to do it. And there are plenty of people who feel that way, but there are also plenty of people who say, where's my peace? And we are educating an entire generation of kids to be the latter kind, to actually see the personally responsible person as defective. Like, what's wrong with you? Even radical, even dangerous. And if you think about the whole mask and vaccine debate, those are people, the people who are not going to just cave to a mandate. Those are people who say, I'm responsible for my health, not you. Go ahead, get a vaccine if you want, wear a mask if you want. I'm not going to tell you not to, but you don't have a right to tell me what to do. And I'll take care of me. You're not responsible for my health. I'm not responsible for yours. I am not a jerk. I'm not going to go around coughing in your face. If I have a fever, I'm not leaving my house because I'm not an idiot and I'm not cruel, right? But that's not the same thing as, you telling me, like I said in my video the other day, put on a diaper so you don't wet your pants. That I'm not responsible for you. And that's what people don't seem to understand. It's a total conflict. Like Thomas Sowell would say, conflict of visions. Great book, by the way. You should read it. But you've got people who just have one vision that, leave me alone. And another group of people like, no, you can't be because you're dangerous. And right now, those people are in charge of our K-12 education, and our universities in America. They're just in charge of it. They control it 100% in every possible way. So they control the universities educating our teachers. They control the boards of ed that are, setting certification standards and choosing curriculum standards. They're controlling organizations, research organizations like this, and people who are developing curricula. They control all of this. There's nobody with any influence in education right now who disagrees with this. There are plenty of people who disagree with it. They don't hold any sway. And if you're curious what the end game is, a lot of people have asked me, well, Deb, what's the end game? What's their plan? I mean, well, other than revolution, although I think they still imagine it's just going to evolve organically and the country is just going to be different. The country's just going to belong to them. And we're going to be a single party country, and we're going to have single payer and universal basic income, and everything's going to be beautiful and utopian. And all these naughty little conservatives, these, deplorables, will have to either cope with it or, I don't know, maybe they'll need to be re-educated or something, right? Crack a few eggs or whatever they were going to plan to do with us. But the end game in terms of schools is something they call the community school. Talked about it months ago when I did that live stream of the equity conference that the Department of Education had to talk about equity in education in America. They mentioned many, many times about the community school and getting the community centered around the school. And people, I think back then were like, well, isn't the community now centered around the school? No, it's not. That's not community. That's like a, like a network. Okay. The people who go to public school, they would like to have mandatory universal pre-K. Oh, we'll take your baby now. Come on. Is it 2, 3? Okay. Come on. Hand it over. They would like that. The kid goes through public school all the way through. They want it to be public all the way through college. That would be their perfect ideal. Although they're never going to get rid of the big IVs and so forth. They would just like to have some continuity all the way through of similar messaging. They want to put the healthcare center right there in the school. And I wouldn't be surprised at some point if they have foster care facilities and or dormitories also centered at the school. You might be interested to know that this is the same model that a certain Adolf Hitler implemented. One of the first things that he did, in fact, was he implemented universal pre-K, community schooling, hired special teachers that were well grounded in his ideology, and they shifted around what they were teaching. Academics took a lower rung to his version of SEL at the time, which was, of course, their ethnic purity and racial purity lessons and health and all this kind of stuff. And they did spend a lot more time outside doing calisthenics and that sort of stuff because they were trying to make superhumans. But they replaced the teachers, the academic intellectual teachers, with teachers who were going to come in and focus pretty much on their version of the National Socialist SEL. Like, this is what it takes to fit yourself into the collective of our society and see yourself as a cog in our machine. That's what he did. And then everything was centered around the school, not the parents. Everything was centered around the school. Healthcare was centered around the school. Child rearing was centered around the school. And parents were also getting re-educated if they, weren't on board. That's what they want. That's what they really want. And of course, the irony is there will always be people who can keep themselves outside of this, right? People who have lots of money already have school choice and don't have to deal with this. They can either just leave the school and handpick a private school that isn't doing this if they're already left, because private schools are just as bad, many of them, or they can homeschool. Although I don't have a lot of money, you can, it's certainly easier if one person doesn't have to work. But the people who are going to be subjected to this are the people who have two parents who have to work, single parents, some, it's harder to homeschool. They're, stuck. This is what they're stuck with. And they can't get out. They're like a captive audience. Now, I'll be the first one to tell you can get out. It's just not as obvious. That's why I exist, is to try to help people. In this space, to try to help people find their way out or join with other people to find a way out. But I do think you need to find a way out. I don't think there's coexisting with this. I think if you align with that left-hand column, even that middle column, you're putting your child into a setting that is hostile to your existence. It is hostile to your values. It is hostile to what you want for your child. So you can get out. It's just going to take a little more work. And like I said, I'd be happy to try to help you. And I know there are many, many other people who would. Not everything has to be homeschool. Like, you don't have to be home at your kitchen table doing it. There are other means. There are co-ops. There are micro schools. There are online academies. Many schools are already forcing you to go online. At least you can handpick the teachers. You can handpick the curriculum. It's still a far cry from that. And then get your kids involved in some civic activities of your choosing. Some sports and some other things with, other homeschool kids, or some through your local recreational center that are not affiliated with your school, for as long as those last. Which brings me to my next point, that one way to fight back against this is do everything you can in your area to strengthen those other resources. So even if your kids are in public school and you're just trying to figure out a way out, start participating in your local recreational center or your local rec groups. Or if you have, Rotary, Kiwanis, whatever, like, see if you can get some of these local organizations to be revived and provide services for kids in your community, because that's the key to getting them away from the social structure of the school. And once you supplement, then when you can just get the academics taken care of, which you can very easily, you don't have to be in the school at all. For now, it's legal. So the more people pull out now, the longer it's going to stay legal. That's just how it is. They're going to have a harder time getting people back into the schools when they're gone than keeping you there if you're already there. So I think we are approaching possibly a tipping point or a time limit in some places. I could see it happening in some states where they come up with a way to make it so difficult that it's borderline illegal. And if the teachers unions and the Democratic Party get their way, they will eventually make it illegal. When I say eventually, maybe after your kids are out of school, but it could happen. So we have to build other ways, and that's something that I'm working on too. Anyway, I've gone kind of off topic here. Thank you guys so much for joining me for this very important topic. Please like, share, comment, all that. I wish I could put this down below, but it is a PDF, so I don't think I can. But you can look it up. Let me copy the name of it, and you might be able to get it online on your own. I'll put it in the comments area. Oh, it didn't paste. Oh, that's right, because it's a PDF. I can't even copy it. So Transformative Social and Emotional Learning. Let me put it back up for you one more time. So you can see it. Transformative Social and Emotional Learning, SEL toward SEL in service of education, equity, and excellence. And this is by no means like the only thing like this, but it is. The other thing I'll tell you, if you're on Twitter, please follow Jennifer McWilliams. Jennifer McWilliams, she has a YouTube channel as well. She is an authority on the subject, as is Jason Littlefield. Those are two people you can follow. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend, and I will see you next time. Bye.